Hi, welcome back. So we left it at the end of the last presentation that we'd gone through the concepts and our ideas behind socialism. It's now time for us to look at different types of socialism, and certainly the different types of socialism you're going to need to talk about in the EdXL A-level politics. And remember, the question you're going to be asked is something along the lines of this: evaluate the extent to which different schools of your ideology agree on a particular concept. And we'll be looking at that as we go through this particular presentation. But I suppose before we should do that, we should focus on the various different types of socialism that we have to look at in this game. So we're going to start off with revolutionary socialism. And this starts from the premise that I explored in my previous presentation on revolutionary socialism and Marx and Lenin, that capitalism induces within us a false consciousness. Now, the idea there is that our true consciousness, the true consciousness is that idea of empathy and solidarity, social solidarity. But what happens when we have capitalism is that it perverts it. It perverts us away from that, and it introduces us to a life of consumerism and materialism. The idea that we can get involved in this capitalist pursuit such that the solution becomes whoever dies with the most toys wins. So that's what capitalism induces. It's a perversion of our natural state, and it can neither be contained nor can it be tamed. We need to get rid of it. We need a revolution. And just at this point, I want to change it a little bit, because there's a revolution in more than one sense that we can talk about here. In the first instance, we need a revolution because democracy can't stop capitalism. The capital-owning classes are have control of the society. They have control of the mechanism of the state, and as a result of that, you're never going to get them to give up democracy. Through democracy, you're never going to persuade the ruling class voluntarily to submit themselves to a new administration. So what we need is a physical revolution to create new systems of rule. We need to get out the old and start again. So we need to remain that idea of trade union consciousness somehow. Whether you do that in a Leninist way or a Maoist way, it doesn't really matter. Or indeed, if you do it like Rosa Luxemburg, and she argued that Marx was right and Lenin was wrong, and that nobody had tried hard enough. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself there, because now we're getting onto the thinkers. The second sense in which we need to think about revolution is not just overthrowing the rulers, but also a reboot of society, a revolutionary reboot of the things that we do. So we need to rethink the way in which our institutions and our structures are organized. And perhaps more importantly, we need to revert to the old way of mind, that we should revert to the empathetic social solidarity model of human thinking. So just bear in mind that when we're talking about revolutionary socialism, everyone talks about this one, the idea that you can't achieve socialism through the ballot box. But once you've done that, you need the state to stay around for a little while to organize this institutional reboot. And again, here we're starting to edge upon the ways in which the different schools of socialism differ. I'm getting ahead of myself. I should just reel this back in a little bit. Also, of course, your revolutionary socialism is obsessed with fundamental equality. Equality in terms of moral outcome, moral value, and the only way really of doing that is through the common ownership of the means of production. That's how common ownership of everything. We abolish private property. All property is theft, and so we achieve absolute equality by cutting the Gordian knot. You can't distribute things in a way that's even. It just can't be done. You can either give everybody the same, but that's not fair, because some people need more than others, so you give them more and others get less, and then you can argue that's not fair. So the only way of squaring this circle is to ensure that all property is held in common. Rather like having a race, if you've got someone in there faster than everybody else, then they're going to win. So that's fair. Is it? Or maybe we should make it so that everybody ends at the same time. So is that fair? Yeah. The only way of solving that is not to have a race in the first place, and that brings us back to the ownership of capital. So, what are we looking at? We are looking at entirely new versions of the human condition, or rather we're seeking to drag humanity back to its natural setting, away from this perversion of the natural state that comes about when you unleash capitalism on the human consciousness. So they argue that we are currently living in a false consciousness, but once appraised of the reality of the situation, then we would be able to be turned to the useful and the good. The state has an interesting role. The state has to expand massively in order to achieve the reboot. So the expansion there is required for the reboot. And then once that's happened, it can shrink, it can contract back to, well, ultimately to nothingness. Because if we have achieved the empathetic state, then there is absolutely no need for the state to continue to exist. If we're living in as communist utopia where we have absolute equality and no one's exploiting anybody, then we just don't need the state. So the state can wither away in that utopian sense. So our social organization, we have that empathetic collective on all levels. So again, we don't need the state because we're all working together. We don't need the state, so we can just get on with things, working in communion. We have done away with all divisive forces, whether that's the patriarchy, the class or religion, potentially even nationalism. I always have a massive digression when we come to this in class, and I talk about the way in which in the First World War, the Marxists couldn't understand why the people in the trenches didn't just turn around and instead of shooting each other, shoot the generals who were ordering them to shoot people with whom they had much more in common than those from whom they were taking the orders. But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked into that. But the idea is that we move towards international socialism. The thing that's stopping international socialism, solidarity, workers of the world unite and all of that stuff, is this wedding to a false consciousness of patriotism, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori, as Wilfred Owen memorably said. The economy is a mechanism that the state has to exploit in the first instance to retool the whole setup to the point whereby we can the state can back off. So massive expansion of state economy again. We saw that in Russia with industrialization and collectivization. We saw a massive expansion of the state, but it got stuck at that point for various reasons, and eventually mutated into a totalitarianism or indeed a Gleichschaltung. So the Soviet Union got stuck in that transitional phase that we're talking about here, this massive expansion, and it didn't get the chance to contract. The reasons for that, long and complicated, and probably beyond the scope of this particular video. So that's revolutionary socialism. I think the way in which you need, the key thing to get across here, is the nature of the state. The way in which the state expands to reorganize society, and then society, having been reorganized along these massively empathetic lines, it can contract. The same with the economy. The economy, the state has to expand in order to reorganize, and then it contracts. In fact, it contracts until basically it dissolves. So the state dissolves under its own redundancy. It didn't quite happen in the Soviet Union, but never mind. Social democracy is a different beast altogether. Social democracy says, okay, empathy is the natural state, but you know what? So is self-interest. And self-interest as a motivating factor can be a very, very valuable device. And so social democracy seeks to harmonize empathy and social interest, enabling the good and containing the bad for overall gain. It also rejects the idea of revolution in lieu of democratic process. It believes that democracy can be achieved through the democratic process. Here we're looking particularly at people like Webb and also Crossland, of course, but primarily Webb. And then perhaps more so moving towards the Crossland side of things, capitalism is a useful tool for the generation of growth. I think we have to accept that nothing can quite generate economic growth like capitalism, but it needs to be managed. Now, this is a lovely phrase. It's variously attributed to a number of people, not least Keynes. But having looked at it, it looks like it came from E.A.G. Robinson. And what we're seeing here is capitalism is predicated on greed. It's the nastiest of motives of nasty people. So capitalism is all about allowing greedy people to do greedy things. Left to its own devices, that's not going to achieve anything. It's just going to achieve lots and lots of good things for the greedy people and not very much for everybody else. And so what we need to do is we need to moderate and manage that capitalism so that the fruits of all that economic growth can be distributed equitably or fairly. However, of course, we choose to decide our equitably and fairly. So, excuse me. So what we're looking at is capitalism can be deployed. Social change can be engineered gradually through various mechanisms I'm going to discuss in a second. We're looking at equality here of moral value and to a certain extent outcome. We're not looking at absolute equality of outcome, but we're looking at something that's certainly more fair, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, and that is perceived to be some form of equality. Now then, under your social democracy, we're looking at reform systems of the state. It's ongoing and it's necessary. Remember, in our revolutionary society, in our revolutionary socialism, the state achieves what it wants to do and then it withers away. That's not the case with social democracy. With social democracy, what we have here is ongoing and necessary because it's seeking to juggle two competing ideas, empathy and self-interest. So the state has to exist. The state has this persistent role managing society, saving society from those capitalist forces that we've unleashed. So we're dancing a bit of a tricky fandango here. We are embracing capitalism because it generates economic growth, but it also unleashes divisive forces within society that we need to manage, and that is the role of the state. It's there to reconcile empathy and self-interest. That means that there's a big role for the state in our social organization. Again, we're seeking to minimize the divisive forces that capitalism unleashes. And we can do that through collective endeavor in institutions, particularly things like institutional or national schools, hospitals, some elements of the welfare state coming in there. But certainly we're looking at schools and hospitals as a very good way of achieving some form of social homogeneity, some sort of common endeavor through those institutions. Within the economy, we're broadly Keynesian. For those of you who aren't economists, that is essentially the financial redistribution from the rich to the poor to reduce wealth inequality. We're looking at organizing industry through nationalization and state-run industries and state subsidies and all of that sort of stuff to provide full employment. And we're also looking at welfare to catch those who are dropped by capitalism. So key point here is, again, the role of the state. The state has a big role and an ongoing role. The state is there to deliver social change and economic change that will deliver that sort of fairer society off the back of it. We're generating growth, but we're making sure that the fruits of that growth are shared fairly, and we are then going to make sure that our social institutions are there to bring people together rather than to divide them through separate provision of services, be that education, health, those two primarily. And I'm sure you can come up with your own examples. Okay, well, I've got the third way to come up now. There's no way I'm going to get that one done in 3 minutes. So I'm going to kill this one right there, and we'll come back, look at the third way, and then look at the thinkers in our third and final installment of socialism. So see you in a few minutes.